Welcome to the Risk and Trends, Politica's Insight Annual Conference. This year, due to the unpredictability caused by the pandemic, we decided to organize an audienceless conference in our studio. In 10 thematic blocks, together with our friends, partners and guests, we try to tell the world as we see it. My name is Piotr Łukasiewicz and I am an international relations researcher at Politica Insight. And I'm pleased to lead today's conversation on state of the world affairs. Our guest is Dr. Karen Donfried. She is the president of the German Marshall Fund, the leading US international affairs think tank, and one of the intellectual cornerstones of transatlantic cooperation. Karen joined GMF in 2001 and since then worked also in various capacities for the US government. It's worth to mention her work at the National Security Council as the Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Director of European Affairs. Mrs. Donfried became the president of GMF after she left the government in 2014. Hello, Karen. First, let me start with something I hope will be encouraging and uplifting message. How was German Marshall Fund, the organization you lead, during the pandemic, during the last year? It was obviously a very tragic year for all humankind, but also challenging and showing a lot of strength in humans. More specifically, I'm asking about the role of expertise. You are leading one of the most prominent and leading think tank on international relations, full of experts. I recently read the book of Tom Nichols, Death of Expertise, which was being announced for a couple years now, and the pandemic looks like a threshold of such a narrative. What was your organization experience from the last year, and how do you see the role of expertise, of experts in the coming years?
Well, first, it's wonderful to be with you. I remember well being at your conference in person, and I'm just sorry that I can't be in Warsaw with you. Last year was remarkable and tragic because of the pandemic. As you know, we've lost a lot of Americans due to the pandemic, and we struggled to manage it. It has had a very real impact on the German Marshall Fund because most of my colleagues are working from home. I'm actually sitting in the office, but I'm all by myself. And we're lucky in that we can do most of our work virtually. So on the one hand, I think there's a sense at GMF that, gosh, we're continuing to have our jobs. We continue to feel that we can have an impact in the transatlantic conversation. And some of my colleagues have become sick with COVID-19, but fortunately, they've all recovered. So that's good news. The challenging part of the pandemic is that programs like our Marshall Memorial Fellowship, which brings young professional Europeans to the US and sends young professional Americans to Europe, of course, cannot take place right now. So there are several aspects of our programming that we've had to stop. And I think this is a moment where we need more transatlantic dialogue, not less. So we have made a hard pivot to virtual convening. And what we found is that those digital platforms work very well for GMF because we have an office footprint that includes 8 different locations. So when my colleague in Warsaw, Michael Baranowski, organizes something, he's now not just organizing it for a Warsaw audience, but he can use that digital platform to invite the entire GMF network to participate. And that's been a great opportunity for us. A second opportunity with the pandemic has been to include conversations about public health in the programming that we do. So we've done a series of events where we look to US epidemiologists or European public health officials to share the lessons they've learned from trying to combat COVID-19 in their countries. And it's been great. This gets to your question about expertise. It's been wonderful to be able to try to have those kinds of hard facts and real experience reach our transatlantic audience. So let me stop with that.
Obviously, as you rightly said, the main point of your main idea behind GMF is a transatlantic relations, and we are living in the days after the most important events in the United States on the other side of Atlantic. I mean the inauguration of Biden administration of 20th January was the most obvious and most important topic now, especially given the dramatic circumstances surrounding this inauguration. I'm talking about obviously the 6th of January events at the Capitol. Whole thing about the whole point of Biden administration and the president himself is that the change is coming. But let me play a devil's advocate for this bit, for this moment. Why would actually Europeans, especially those who were so frightened, so battered during the last 4 years because of the certain politics of previous administration, why would they believe that the change in the U.S. policy, U.S. politics, in the U.S. position in the world is maybe not permanent, but is somehow stable? The images of riots storming capitals were really frightening to all of us, and they were actually used by the U.S., by the Chinese propaganda, by Russian propaganda, which said, "Look, America is in the decline. Look what is happening, and how dare Americans how they dare to instruct other countries what is democracy." So, what do you think? How deep are the roots of isolationism, of populism inside American politics?
You've put a lot on the table, and let me answer 3 separate questions that you posed. First, you started by talking about the role of GMF, and I do think it might be helpful for those listening to understand a little more deeply what my organization is focused on. We have this complicated name, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which captures the history. In 1972, on the 25th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, the then West German government wanted to say thank you to the United States for Marshall Plan assistance. So in broad terms, we try to strengthen transatlantic cooperation. And we do that through an office footprint that has headquarters in Washington, but then we're in Warsaw, in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, in Belgrade, in Bucharest, and in Ankara. So it really is a continent-wide presence on the European side. We do policy work, we have leadership programs, and we're also very active in promoting civil society, particularly in the Balkans and the Black Sea region. And I certainly look at the Marshall Plan as a quintessential example of enlightened U.S. leadership, where on the one hand, the Marshall Plan was helpful in practical terms in rebuilding European economies, but also was good for the U.S. because these were markets for U.S. products and countries that became essential allies. So just a bit about GMF. We are nonpartisan and we are transatlantic, and we are values-based. So we believe in the power of democratic systems. Okay, so let me put that there. Then you talked about what a tumultuous year we've already had in the United States. And lots of people here in Washington have been talking about how nice it was a week ago Wednesday to have a Wednesday that was calm. You talked about January 6th. We had a riot at the United States Capitol. I never in my life thought I would see an assault on the U.S. Capitol which for many of us Americans is the symbol of U.S. democracy. I actually worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years. So you're saying it was distressing to watch this from Warsaw. It was, believe me, even more distressing to watch this as an American. And then the following Wednesday, we had a vote in the House of Representatives on impeachment for a second time for President Trump. And then the third Wednesday in January, we had the inauguration of Joe Biden as president. So this has not been a quiet 2021 to date. And that brings us to the transatlantic relationship and your comment that Europeans are saying, well, okay, President Biden, Vice President Harris, their team is saying, we believe in alliances. We want to rebuild those relationships. The United States wants to be a constructive force in the world. We're back. We want to work through multilateral organizations. So President Biden immediately rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. He's made clear that he's not leaving the World Health Organization. We could go through the list. So the Biden administration is sending a message, America is back, and we want to work with our allies on the big problems of the day, whether that's fighting the pandemic, whether it's how we're going to recover economically from this public health crisis, whether it's how are we going to stop or mitigate the climate crisis, whether it is security threats, technology. So the administration is saying, we're ready to engage with Europe. And then some Europeans are saying, well, okay, we still feel a bit shocked by the past 4 years. And a U.S. president in Donald Trump who felt that alliances are transactional and believed that the United States had gotten a bad deal from the Europeans. And many Europeans felt he did tremendous damage, not only to concrete aspects of the relationship, but to the trust that undergirds the alliance. And I've heard many Europeans say, well, Donald Trump may no longer be U.S. president, but Trumpism is still alive and well in the United States. And we don't know what's going to happen in 2024 at the next U.S. election. You know, maybe either Donald Trump is reelected or there is someone who shares those same beliefs. So we're wary of working with the United States. Interestingly, I think you see some questions on the U.S. side too, where some Americans are saying, well, okay, so yes, the United States is stronger when it works together with its closest allies, but are the Europeans going to bring a strategic view to the table? And are they going to bring capabilities to the table to help us reach agreed on outcomes? And what I would say to both groups of skeptics is, look, we've got big problems that both sides of the Atlantic are facing. And this is not a moment for hand-wringing. This is a moment to see if transatlantic cooperation can actually deliver for our citizens. Because I think Americans and Europeans working together need to show Poles and Americans and Germans and French and pick your nationality that working together, we actually can get things done. Because I think a lot of our citizens are questioning that premise. So I would say, let's get to work and test this.
Trump's America last 4 years was very much realistic about the politics. When you have these big international theories like realism, liberalism, so Trump's America was very much realistic. National interest matters, big power games matter. To quote the former president, "World is a very nasty place." This is his words. Europe, in the same period of time, was very much kind of missing the old United States, was presenting this call to let's go back to the transatlantic values. Right now, we have a Biden administration, again, presenting this liberal approach. Human rights value, democratic values are important for the modern world. And on the European part, we have a situation, kind of a, as you call it in the United States, a cold shoulder given to the advances from Mr. Biden. Germany is following its economic interest when it comes to economic exchange with China, giving kind of a blind eye to the human rights abuses in China. France used last 4 years to promote this European strategic autonomy and elevate its role on the European platform. So you have this rise of realistic thinking on the European side. Maybe it could be some beneficial, but the problem is, as you mentioned, the problem is this kind of a shift in the phases. So both sides cannot get along, cannot march to make the same steps, and I think this is the challenge for leaders on the both sides of Atlantic to actually get in the line. How to do it? How to practically do it?
Well, I think I'm maybe less pessimistic than you are. So when I look at the glass, that's kind of measuring transatlantic relations, I see it as half full. I don't see it as half empty. And I would not agree that the Biden administration is getting a cold shoulder from Europeans. I think that his election was greeted, in some cases, with a deep sigh of relief, in other cases with real excitement about what Americans and Europeans might be able to do together. Now, that said, I would agree that the problems we're facing are challenging. So this is not easy. We've seen the Biden administration, I would argue, move with exceptional speed on some of these issues, whether it was immediately rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, and climate is an issue that is of utmost priority to our European allies. And Biden has been very clear in saying, my work here isn't ending with signing or re-signing the Paris Agreement. We have to work harder and do more. And you've seen it with his appointments, including John Kerry having this outsized role driving the climate agenda here and abroad. Just the agreement yesterday on New START, again, very quick action on a matter that also was very important to our European allies. You put some issues on the table that are hard. You mentioned China. I think there's real enthusiasm in Germany about working with a Biden administration, but that doesn't mean that from one day to the next, we are going to agree on how to engage China. And let's just stick with that example for the moment. You have seen a change in the U.S. over the past 4 years, where there is a bipartisan consensus that the United States needs to be tougher with China. There was a long-standing belief that if China economically liberalizes, that would lead to greater political liberalization. And there is a bipartisan consensus that that theory has turned out not to be true. We have seen China liberalize economically, but have seen no sign of political liberalization. And over the past 4 years, we've seen ever more egregious human rights abuses by the Chinese, whether it is the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang or whether it is the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. And the question then is, how do we Americans and how do Europeans react to that? And it is clear that the Biden administration, on the one hand, believes that we have lost ground in this over the past 4 years, and further believes that the United States has a distinctive advantage in this competition with China in that we have important allies who share our values, who share our goals. And so the view of the Biden administration is we want to work together with those allies. Now, I personally am someone who doesn't understand why there was a rush in the final days of 2020 for the Europeans, for the EU to sign up to this comprehensive agreement on investment with the Chinese. And we did see that lone tweet from the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying
yes,
how eager they were for early consultations with the Europeans on China. So I think the CAI, as it's called, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, is unfortunate, but I don't think that means we're not going to see serious U.S.-European cooperation on forging a common path on China regarding the whole set of issues, from free and fair trade to technology and 5G and Huawei. So, I think you're going to see Kurt Campbell, who has been named as having this broad role as a coordinator, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, work very closely, not only to unify the U.S. government on this, but to bring our allies in. And I'm not saying that's going to be easy, but I think both sides realize the imperative of that cooperation.
Speaking of China-Europe cooperation, again, I was also very much interested or even shocked when after the famous tweet of Jake Sullivan, the coming security advisor to the president, Europeans reacted even by accelerating the signing of this agreement. So that was maybe that was one of the sources of my pessimism that you sense in this conversation. But
that, can I just comment on that, because I think it's a really important point. Why was it that after 7 years of negotiation on this investment agreement, there was a conclusion in the final days of 2020? There's no question in my mind that the reason the Chinese moved on the issues that had been blocking final agreement was because they knew a Biden administration was coming in. So the Chinese had a real incentive to conclude an agreement before the Biden administration took office. On the European side, it was clear that Chancellor Merkel wanted to conclude this agreement during the German presidency of the EU. It has long been clear that Germany does not want, I don't think any European country wants a new Cold War with China. Actually, I don't think the Biden administration wants a Cold War with China. So it was important to Merkel that this one cooperative piece of the relationship with China be concluded, both because she believes in a relationship with China that has competitive tracks as well as cooperative tracks, and this was the one remaining cooperative piece, and surely because German industry has a major interest in the Chinese market. So it's a really fascinating case study of the very real tension that is there between the geopolitical reality of the relationship with China and the economic interdependence. So I do think there are a lot of interesting lessons to draw from that particular example.
There is also one part of this China-European cooperation. The narrow part of it is Central Europe-China cooperation. Chinese are making for a long time now overtures to the so-called 17+1 countries in the Central Europe. How do you think these countries, mostly Poland is of course comes to mind, how these countries should navigate this very complicated relations? We depend on U.S. in this part of Europe. We depend on U.S. militarily. We depend economically on Western Europe. So how we should these countries here in this part of Europe, how we should navigate the Scylla and Charybda of U.S.-China global relations?
Thanks for asking that, because I think this is an interesting part of the China story too. I talked about how you can see a bipartisan consensus growing over the past 4 years in the United States with regard to China. I would argue that if you look at the European side of the equation, that European views toward China have changed more over the past 3 years than they have over the past decade and more. Why is that? I think there are various reasons for it, but surely one is that Europeans used to see the relationship with China as Europeans selling their products to China. What you've seen more recently is it's not about Europe going to China, it's about China coming to Europe. The clearest example of that is the Belt and Road Initiative, where Europeans stepped back and said, oh my goodness, China is coming west and it is buying up valuable European infrastructure. And we need to pay attention to that. And China then began very successfully to divide the Europeans. And you mentioned in particular their outreach to Central and Eastern Europe. And we have seen how successful that outreach has been and how in very specific cases it has led to divisions within the European Union. So you saw Europe realizing the challenge this presented. We saw the German Federation of Industries put out a paper talking about China as a systemic rival. We saw the European Union produce a paper where it also used the same language. So I think European attitudes have shifted, and there is an attempt to try to build that consensus within the EU. Now, interestingly, after the CAI, after this comprehensive agreement on China was signed, what did China do immediately the next week? Another crackdown on pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong and an invitation to the Central and East Europeans in that 17+1 format to a meeting. So China was clearly sending the signal, signing this agreement is in no way tempering our behavior. In fact, China seemed emboldened. And it's going to be interesting to see if the European Parliament approves that agreement, because we've seen the signing of the CAI not only spark a conversation, a dialogue here in Washington and with the Europeans, but we've seen very different reactions within Germany and within Europe about this agreement and whether the Europeans should be concluding it. So I think the answer to your specific question about Central Europe is twofold. One is the extent to which Europeans through the EU and increasingly through NATO, because what we saw in that NATO 2030 product was a desire for NATO to have a more serious conversation about China. So can we forge a common position, A, and B, if not, how do the Central and East Europeans manage their economic interests with China when, as you noted, their very important security partner, the United States, in very concrete terms, is saying, be careful on 5G. You know, if you're a NATO member, you are exposing your systems to Chinese espionage, potentially, because the Chinese Communist Party will always have a back door into those Huawei systems. So I think the Central and East Europeans are going to be managing these different priorities that they have. And I do think this will be a major topic of the transatlantic conversation with the Biden administration.
I have also questions about the vision for NATO, as you mentioned, the report NATO 2030. But before that, I would like to ask about the other report, which actually you co-authored along with Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, the Transatlantic Relations 2021 and Beyond. One of the first point of this recommendation, actually, this was very bipartisan. It was published before the election, so it wasn't the expectation that Biden or Trump would win, but rather something, as you see, as a polar star of the transatlantic relations, as I understood it. So one of the main postulates, one of the main points of this report was, especially given the time we live in, was a joint U.S.-European response for storing medical resources and giving importance to WHO, the health organizations, in access to treatment, which would change the future responses for the future pandemics. We are living right now in the times where we could observe quite shameful discussion inside the European Union, discussion with the vaccine producers about what is happening to the vaccines promised to the European Union countries. Also, parallelly, we have developing countries which are kind of left to their own devices when it comes to providing their societies, their communities with vaccines, and actually, you could understand them that the only countries they could count on is China or Russia, with their own Chinese and Russian vaccines that could be provided to these developing countries. Also in some kind of vein of the pessimistic, optimistic approach to the transatlantic relations. How would you comment on this, given in the light of your recommendations from the report? How would you comment on that discussion and what's happening with the vaccines and the fight with the pandemic nowadays?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for mentioning the task force that I co-chaired with Wolfgang Ischinger, who is a former German ambassador to the United States and now is chairman of the Munich Security Conference. And Wolfgang and I were talking about the state of the transatlantic relationship. Actually, it was late in 2019 that we started this conversation. And we agreed that we wanted to pull together a group of people from both sides of the Atlantic who have different political perspectives, who are in different sectors. We really wanted to bring together a group of people who were diverse. And we wanted to bring them together to think about concrete policy suggestions for the transatlantic relationship. Our impetus was not to improve transatlantic relations. Our impetus was there are big problems we are facing in the world, and we don't think either the United States or Europe can solve them alone. But we need the combined heft of these two to actually have a positive influence on the outcome. So that was the driving force. And then you could argue, well, if you have a positive influence on the outcome, that might be good for transatlantic relations because people would see the relationship delivering. Fair enough. But the impetus really was to have a positive outcome to meet these challenges. So we kicked off the task force, and it was intended to put forward a series of policy proposals that could appeal to either a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. There was surely a level of ambition in those policy proposals, so some may have been more attractive to one than the other, but we were trying to provide a menu for either outcome. We, of course, had not anticipated the pandemic. And when that hit in March of last year, it preempted the first meeting of the task force. So rather than all getting together in Hamburg, Germany, we got together virtually. And we felt we had to add the pandemic to our list of challenges. And we also were so disheartened to see the national and nationalist responses to the pandemic in the first instance, right? I mean, we saw this in the US and we saw it in every European country, that we all wanted to keep personal protective equipment for ourselves, put in place export barriers, X, Y, and Z. And that was not a healthy reaction on any of our parts. So we included the pandemic in the task force, and you shared some of the very concrete suggestions that we had. When it comes to vaccine production and distribution, we felt it was critical that Americans and Europeans work together on a plan for equitably distributing the vaccine globally. We all know that the Trump administration did not feel the World Health Organization was doing good work here, and President Trump put the WHO on notice that the U.S. would be leaving. President Biden has reversed that decision, and he immediately joined in the COVAX effort at the World Health Organization that is focused on this issue of distributing vaccines globally. I think that it is critical that Americans and Europeans lead on this. And I do believe this is an example of enlightened self-interest. Americans and Europeans should care about this because it's the right thing to do. And we should be concerned about countries that cannot afford these vaccines and figure out how we can help them vaccinate their populations, because it's just the right thing to do. But it's also good for the US and Europe and all developed countries, because you only are going to be able to manage the pandemic once the vast majority of citizens around the world have been vaccinated. So that's what I would say about global distribution. Then to your last point about how this issue of vaccine production and vaccine distribution is roiling the waters of the European Union, that also has been stunning in recent weeks. Now, I, of course, understand the decision that EU member states made to say, okay, we're not going to manage this at national level. We're going to turn this over to the European Union. That decision surely was based on the unfortunate way in the spring EU member states responded to the pandemic and responded to protecting their personal protective equipment. So nobody wanted to relive that. And that makes sense. But over the past weeks, obviously, there's been a real disappointment in the EU about the role that the Commission is playing here. And there have been real questions about the competence of the EU in playing this role. And I do think that we're seeing this be a real challenge to solidarity within the European Union. So my hope is that very quickly the European Union can get ahead of this and in fact deliver the requisite number of vaccination doses across the EU. The other sort of interesting aspect of this has been the role of the UK, because we're already in a challenging time for the European Union now that the UK has, obviously it left the European Union last year, but now that the future agreement between the UK and the European Union has been decided, just as you're trying to build this new relationship, you have this vaccination crisis where the EU is not looking very competent and the UK is looking much more competent. So I think there's an added strain, and also because of the specifics of what happened with the border on the island of Ireland related to vaccine distribution. But you have this added element of the role of the UK in all of this that is complicating. So, my hope is that the EU can really pivot and show its competence in a way that it hasn't over the past 2 weeks.
So I have another question regarding the European relations and the US position on these relations. Nord Stream 2 is obviously the main hotspot in Europe. Central Europe, with Poland as one of the most fervent critics of this project, sees this project as a sign of German-Russian rapprochement with almost historical proportions. Trump administration, on its part, adopted very decidedly anti-Nord Stream stance, including the threats of sanctions. What do you think is expected? I mean, what would be the position of the Biden administration?
This is an issue where you have seen a strong bipartisan consensus in the United States. The Obama administration did not support Nord Stream 2. As you noted, former President Trump was a harsh critic of Nord Stream 2, and it is clear that the Biden administration also does not support Nord Stream 2. The question is, what do you do now? As a side comment to someone who is sitting outside of government, looking at this, it's hard to imagine that the economic benefit of this for Germany in any way outweighs at this point the incredible political fallout of this decision. And it was interesting after Navalny was poisoned to see for the first time a potential rethinking of Nord Stream 2 in terms of the Merkel government. We've not seen any action on that. We have seen real criticism from some within her own party. I'm thinking here of Norbert Röttgen, the chair of the German Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, who's been very critical of Nord Stream 2. So there was a question of whether Navalny's poisoning was going to be a turning point for Chancellor Merkel herself. We haven't seen that. I do expect that Nord Stream 2 is going to be a significant area of discussion for the Biden administration with the Merkel government. And I'm not sure what the solution is. I'm not sure it's putting more sanctions on. It seems to me that it's diplomacy. And I think we've got some fantastic diplomats in place now who are going to be talking to their German counterparts and figuring out what a solution here could be. But I think the U.S. position on this has been consistent over several administrations now, that the United States believes this is bad policy.
Let me devote the last couple minutes of our conversation to the values again. In your blog post on the GMF website, you wrote, and I quote, "The power of a transatlantic cooperation arises most fundamentally from a shared belief in and commitment to the democracy." You also wrote that you believe that we see resilience of democratic values on both sides of the Atlantic. But I'm trying to navigate this conversation to present kind of a realistic and liberal approach. Let me confront your statements with the statement made by one of the American congressmen, actually who was also a guest of one of the GMF webinars when I heard him, who remarked that it is impossible to build an alliance. He was speaking about NATO. It is impossible to build an alliance against Putin if there are leaders in the alliance who are inspired by Putin. Well, of course, I wouldn't dare who was he thinking about, but so we have on your part, we have a kind of a inclusive spirit of GMF confronted with the realism of this gentleman. And I'm asking this question because one of the promises of Biden administration was this quite actually interesting but not very much talked about Summit for Democracy. How do you think, what role will it play, this summit?
This is a fundamental question, and it's something I've thought a lot about in the first month of 2021 because of the events of January 6th. And, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. It really was shocking to me to watch this rampage and this riot in the foremost symbol of our democracy in the U.S. Capitol. And at first, I felt, upset and depressed about it. And what does this say about democracy in the United States? And then, the more I thought about it and thought about the sweep of things that has been happening in this country. And, we have other examples that can feel very heartening about the health of democracy in the United States. When you see just the number of Americans that went out to vote in our recent elections. And that says to me that Americans believe their vote matters. And I think that examples here remind us all that democracy is not an end point. You don't sort of arrive there and you're done, but it is a constant project. And, I've had Europeans say to me, Ronald Reagan used to talk about the shining city on the hill. And you in the United States, you don't represent that anymore. We see how flawed your democracy is. And, when I think about it, I respond and say, but what it's telling us is that all of us need to work every day on the health of our democracies. And we Americans have to understand that there is a wide swath of our citizens who do not feel well served by government. They feel the problems they face every day, the sense that they've been the losers of globalization, that the jobs, the well-paying union jobs they used to have are gone. And what they used to produce is now being produced in China or pick your Southeast Asian country. And that is real. That income inequality is real in this country. The grievances that many of those Americans have are real. Now, I wouldn't support racist grievances or sexist grievances. That is not what we stand for in this country. But we are wrestling with our imperfections and trying to be a more inclusive, effective democracy. And so I think in the transatlantic community, we Americans need to stand up and defend those values. And at the same time, we are trying to be better at home. We continue to need to care about democracy abroad. So I don't think these are, you got to fix your democracy at home and only then can you be a champion of democracy abroad. No, we need to do both of those things at the same time. And that brings us to this summit. And I believe that the term President Biden used was a summit for democracy. I think he didn't say a summit of democracies. And I think that's important because, having a scorecard of, you're a democracy and you're not, that gets pretty challenging. And so, look, I don't know how the administration is planning to organize this, but I just want to draw our attention to that important semantic difference, a summit for democracy. So it seems to me that whomever participates needs to be committed to democracy in their own circumstance and committed to making that democracy deeper, better, getting closer to realizing the ideals that we articulate, but that we do not or have not yet achieved. So I really think that is a shared ambition that should unite us in the transatlantic community, because I certainly believe that small L liberal democracy is the foundation of the transatlantic relationship. And that is what binds the U.S. together with its allies, whether it's those in Europe or those in other parts of the world. And certainly we have seen that we Americans have work to do. But I think that also can be inspiring to others. for us to take on that challenge ourselves. So that is my ambition, not only for my country, but I think it's work we need to do together in the transatlantic community.
Karen, thank you very much. This was supposed to be the discussion about the realistic international relations, but it became, I think, a inspirational discussion. I would say as well. Thank you very much for the time spent with us. Thank you to our audience for those 60 minutes spent in the front of your screen. I would like to encourage you to watch the other recordings for this year's Risk and Trends, and I would like to also thank the partners of this year's conference. Once again, thank you very much.
Well, it was a real pleasure to be with you. I don't at all mean to minimize the challenges we face, but we also have enormous opportunities, and I hope we seize them. And always a pleasure to be with you.